So this is going to be a joint presentation by Jelena Tosic, my dear colleague, and me about how privilege works. You have already heard this. And now I have to switch the slides. Yes, it works. Okay, so that's the two of us. Jelena Tosic is Assistant Professor for Transcultural Studies at the School of Humanities and Social Sciences, and I'm a Senior Lecturer and Professor in Gender and Diversity at the School of Humanities and Social Sciences. Also, special thanks, like always, to the sponsors. It's always necessary to have them for the Diversity and Inclusion Week. And now I come to our topic, because Jelena and me, we have engaged in a transdisciplinary dialogue between critical diversity studies and ethnographies of deservingness. And this is what we are going to present to you today. So here you see a slide with the overview over our input today. So we will start with an introduction and also the aims and questions that have led our transdisciplinary dialogue. Then Jelena will dig into the term deservingness, into discourses, practices, and how deservingness serves as an analytical tool. I will then talk a little more about privilege, understandings of privilege, and connect this understanding to the figure of the ideal worker and relate this ideal worker to critical diversity studies, intersectionality and privilege. And finally, we will both conclude why transdisciplinarity is really interesting to tackle the question of deservingness and privilege. So now I hand over to Jelena.
Thanks a lot, Krista. I hope everyone can hear me as well. Yes, as Krista said, this paper is actually a result of an ongoing conversation, one could say, and this attempt to engage in a transdisciplinary conversation or exchange. And this is where we like to cite Meyerhofer in terms of what transdisciplinarity actually means. So it can be seen as a transgression, regrouping, reconfiguration of questions, theories, methods, and solutions. So it's really about this mutual learning process. What can we learn from each other when we work with different intersecting approaches? And in our case, it's what we explore and try to build on is the synergy of critical diversity studies, primarily an intersectional analytical approach on the one hand, and the anthropological assessments or ethnographies, as we will see more closely, of deservingness. And what we also try actually to do, and as I said, this is an ongoing work, is to develop an analytical heuristic for analyzing privilege, seeing it more clearly or more holistically. So what can an intersectional assessment of privilege learn from the concept of deservingness and vice versa? Okay, next slide, please, Krista.
Yeah.
Thanks. So as Krista said, I will start with speaking a bit more closely or zooming into the concept of deservingness or undeservingness. It's a combined notion, as you can see here with this slash, un/deservingness. So what is this, or what do we mean by when we speak about deservingness? So on the most general level, it can be actually understood as prominent and we would say ascending, so more and more prominent way of how inequality is moralized. And of course, related to that, how distribution is moralized. So who is entitled to what, who deserves what? The research that is done at the school is based in Europe, but of course, the question of deservingness is a global issue. So there are many examples of these debates about deservingness that unfold in the present. Migration, forced migration is, of course, one prominent example that we are all aware of. So these whole debates about, who are the migrants, who are the refugees, who deserves what in terms of status, welfare, social aid, and so on. And looking at these discourses and policies in a critical way is very important in social and cultural sciences. Another example, and some research on this is also done at the school, focusing on the case of Hungary, is this whole issue about, families. What is a family? Which family is deserving of what and why? And Hungary is a specifically interesting and problematic, I would say, example in this regard. Citizenship, another prominent field where deservingness is debated. Who deserves to become a citizen of which country, along which criteria and why, and so on. Also a very important topic. And then, of course, something that also leads us to today's topic of privilege and work is the debates about deserving employment in the first place, but also work status, promotion, and so on. And the list could go on, but I'll stop here and we'll go to the next slide. So a few more insights about this notion of deservingness. So how can we kind of sketch it? What is it about? So first of all, deservingness is not a trait. It's not something static. It's best thought of in terms of a processual and relational notion. So what does this mean? Processual simply means that we are always confronted with a process, like who is seen as deserving or undeserving changes depending on different factors, socioeconomic, cultural images, and so on. So it's a process. And the second fact that it's a relational notion simply means that when people talk about deservingness or claim deservingness or undeservingness, it's always done in relation or in comparison. So someone is deserving or undeserving in comparison to someone else. And there are many examples. This is just one example that I'm picking out how this, because also this is the way how this process about deservingness, thinking process about deservingness started in my case by looking at Austria. There was around 2015, the long summer of migration, this debate in politics and in the everyday context, especially by right-wing politicians, like comparing refugees to national pensioners in terms of who is deserving of which kind of welfare or not. So this is how categories of people or populations are played out against each other. Okay, secondly, this is why deservingness is especially interesting and useful as an analytical tool. It can help us unpack ideological discourses and also understand better how some ideological claims actually also can potentially become law policy. And finally, deservingness is often, this is how the anthropologist Sarah Willen puts it, articulated in a vernacular moral register, which means nothing else than that claims about deservingness are kind of very much at hand. They can be easily picked up and in everyday discourses and conversations without relying on knowledge or in-depth argumentation. So they're very easy to use. Next slide. And the final slide on deservingness before I hand over to Krista, a very good kind of an understand or intuitive way, if you want, but also analytical way to think about deservingness is to look at the figures of deservingness. These are basically social imageries of persons, of groups, of categories which are seen as deserving or undeserving, in particular historical, socioeconomic circumstances. So images of deservingness of social figures which kind of crystallize in certain moments of history, and looking at that, which are these figures, how are they imagined, and why do they emerge in particular moments is very interesting and revealing. And this is just a list of few of those figures. And we will focus on one today. So one famous figure is the social scrounger, different variations of that, and the whole debate you maybe are familiar with, or this image of the welfare queen in the US context is very famous. And looking at these figures in a critical way, of course, in a critical analytical way, is crucial. Then we have, maybe also most prominent today, the figure of the undeserving migrant versus the deserving refugee. As you might have noticed in the media and other contexts, that this kind of binary figure is almost common sense. So it's all about who's an actual refugee and who's just a work migrant. And this is played out along this ascription of deservingness. But then we also have, because deservingness is an analytical tool which helps us look at people who are not only categories who are marginalized, but also people who are well off, if you want. So the privileged ones, as we will also look at today. So the capable entrepreneur, who is that? What kind of, how does this play out in terms of deserving of tax incentives, for example? And finally, the figure that we will focus on today, it's this figure of the ideal, usually male white worker, who is deserving of certain things. So looking at that is really important and interesting. But before I hand over to Krista, this is a small example on the right side that you can see how we also work analytically with our students at the UNI-SG. There was actually a seminar where we cooperated with an artist and a comic novelist, Giulio Camagni, and we actually work together on drawing these figures of undeservingness or deservingness together with our students. So he was drawing and the students were working with him. This is one example of such a figure. And this way of drawing figures, making them visible, is of course a great didactic tool to look at, in a critical way, to unpack these figures and try to understand how they emerge and why. I think I'll stop here and hand over to Krista. Thank you.
Many thanks, Jelena. So I will come back to the figure of the ideal worker. The way Acker has designed this figure already in the 1990s, and how this figure can be critically analyzed through an intersectional perspective and added on with the question of privilege. And just a further remark, this figure is always gendered, and it transforms, as that's similar to what Jelena has already been talking about. These figures transform depending on the particular socioeconomic and cultural context and historical context, and they can really vary. For example, there is the low-skilled, unprivileged, exploitable migrant worker who might still be deserving of a work permit, but undeserving of wealth and social security. Or this is the figure we turn to, the national white worker, the high-skilled worker, deserving of certain privileges like social security, or also because he is seen as a representative of the company, he is attributed certain privileges. Okay, so but what about Acker? Coming back to Acker, she has depicted the ideal worker along several categories, which she has coined as XXX, which already shows an abstract ideal worker is never only characterized by one and only one category, but it's always the interplay of several categories. And this is a very dynamic process. And this is also something we try to grasp by putting together our two perspectives. How do these figures also change, and depending on which category is highlighted. In critical diversity studies, there is quite a debate ongoing about the privileging of certain categories. So that often in companies or in institutions, the category of gender is privileged over other categories like race or migration. And that this causes really a lot of problems in order to grasp where a person is really situated in an organization. But if we go back now to Acker, she has really interestingly shown by the analysis of a lot of companies that the ideal worker is mostly white, about 40 years old, heterosexual, middle class, male, we can add on Christian, and able-bodied. So I mean, the row of categories, you could always enlarge them, but that this has really been the ideal abstract worker for higher managerial positions. On the other hand, within the same company, on another level of the hierarchy, the ideal worker for many jobs is a woman, particularly a woman who employers believe is compliant, who will accept orders and low wages, and maybe also very flexible working hours. And sometimes it's especially immigrant women who are seen as more desirable. So depending on the hierarchy level, the ideal worker, the abstract worker can differ. And these levels build an inequality regime within a company and strengthen hierarchies and are based on inequality. Okay, so now here it is. Okay. So as we all know, in the 21st century, the ideal worker in management is more and more applied to all genders. This is a progress we can see. But on the other hand, Hearn and UNI-SG have conducted a study among middle management female mothers. And this study reveals that their ability to be the independent worker free of care responsibilities is based on the outsourcing of care work to less privileged women, so that we have a care chain which plays out again in an inequality regime. And what is maybe special or a difference to middle management male fathers, that these mothers are very well aware of the privilege they kind of engender, or that they are able to do this outsourcing due to being in a privileged position, and this causes an ambivalence towards their privilege. And very often they experience an inner conflict because they try to be both. They try to be a good mother, a good caregiver, and a good manager. And still they are aware that at the same time, less privileged women do the care work for them. So there's still an inequality between female mothers in management, middle management, and male fathers. Okay, and then a further study we think is very interesting for our question, a study conducted by Avik in Nordic countries among male managers. And what was very interesting in the narrative interviews she did, so in the qualitative interviews about also career paths, that male managers lack to reference to social categories when they talk about themselves. They only use gender, race, and class when they talk about others, maybe co-workers. But with regard to themselves, they are actually quite blind about their positioning due to categories like gender, race, and class. And thereby, the image of the ideal worker normalizes privilege and makes it invisible and unremarkable, in a way not intelligible for these male managers. And what serves for them to explain why they have managed to get in a higher position is meritocracy. So the ascent to managerial positions is explained by deservingness. Yeah, they deserve to be there because they have worked so hard, because they are so good, even if, as Connell has shown in 2010, higher positions do not necessarily correspond with higher skills. And sometimes advantages are unearned, but there is no kind of, they do not actually reflect upon these facts. So privilege and advantage often involve a sense of entitlement and a lack of awareness of being in possession of it. And then maybe third point, Avik uses this intersectional analysis, and Jelena has also already talked about it, not only to look at the marginalized, but also to look at privileged male managers in this case. And thereby it is this analysis is able to show how privilege is produced and upheld. And I hand back to Jelena.
Okay, thanks. Krista, yeah, I'll just keep on breaking down or disentangling this complexity that you have also pointed out, and we can see here nicely how these approaches kind of work together. So this invisibility of privilege, or this kind of self-understood entitlement of certain privileges, is something that's crucial, and it has to be zoomed in. And an ethnographic approach is very useful in this regard. And this is, of course, a transdisciplinary approach, very strongly, or one of the foundations of anthropology and sociology, but also used in other fields of knowledge, also by scholars with intersectional and approaches to diversity. So just a few insights how this ethnographic approach, which means basically spending time in, for example, organizations or with people experiencing forced migration, trying to grasp the complexity of the everyday life, of the complexity of their experiences, encounters with other persons, with institutions, and so on. So it's basically ethnographic research is long-term, immersive, in-depth research, combining different methods, for example, interviews, but also a range of other methods. And it can help us look at these silences, at these self-understandings, at these invisibilities of privilege. And for example, when we want to see, what's behind this silence and this invisibility of privilege, in the case of the male ideal worker, if we stick with this case for a moment, through ethnography, we can, for example, discover that in some cases, what we find behind is a migrant biography of a person and a sense of privilege or deservingness, being deserving of privilege because someone has managed to work oneself up the social ladder, for example, from, for example, a working class background to a managerial one. And what we also find here often is some kind of pride-shame dynamics that's entangled with this sense of being deserving of privilege. But what we can also find, and these are just examples, is a transgenerationally inherited wealth or status, which kind of leads to potentially, of course, I'm just generalizing, to some kind of implicit sense of deservingness, a sense of deserving, a sense of being privileged naturally, and many other things that we could find, which are crucial to look at, to really see in a concrete case, what is this privilege or sense of privilege based on. What we also see through this ethnographic lens is this ambiguity and contradictoriness of the ideal worker or other social categories. And we see how the same persons actually are privileged and unprivileged in different ways at the same time. And here we thought about two examples, and of course the list could go on. It's just to exemplify what we're trying to see. One is the East European IT specialist as the ideal, usually male worker. This figure is very gendered. Who is at the same time seen, for example, by migration regimes in Western Europe as deserving due to this specialized knowledge one possesses, this competence, but also often unprivileged due to origin, East European origin. And what I have seen in my own research is that some people in this constellation are often, for example, paid less than people coming from other countries. So we have this tangent, this ambivalence of being at the same time privileged and unprivileged. Another currently very prominent figure is the care worker, also very gendered, usually the female care worker. And here we see also this contradictoriness and inner tension. In the case of these mostly women who actually live a transnational life, they usually spend regular amounts of time in another country and then go back home. And so they are at the same time unprivileged in the country they are working or providing care work by, for example, not being completely seen as deserving of complete social citizenship. So they're actually precarized in some ways, usually. But at the same time, at home, they're seen as very privileged by their family members and their social networks. And this brings specific tensions and difficulties to them. Thanks. Yeah, so we are moving on to our kind of final slides where we try to summarize this mutual learning process when thinking and combining our approaches. And the first one would be in terms of summarizing a bit what this ethnographic focus on deservingness can offer to colleagues thinking about privilege and diversity. And as I said in my last slide, the first point would be, in a way, to enrich this intersectional analysis of privilege by an ethnographic kind of zooming in particular cases and situations on how privilege is legitimized, what it implies, how is it moralized, in which situations and cases. A second point that's extremely interesting is that looking at these claims of deservingness in their complexity can also show us that even contradicting political ideologies often even are based on the same claims of deservingness or undeservingness. For example, there is at least implicit migrant unfriendly image across ideologies, between left or right, or whatever that means today. But that's another topic. So looking at really kind of contradictory, ambivalent, what are the ideologies today and what do they actually rest on, and how different is this in the first place? And thirdly, that's a very important point also in our research at the UNI-SG. It's that deservingness helps us to see more clearly the lives and challenges not only of people who are marginalized, but also those who are privileged. So it's kind of moving away, looking at inequality and in a more simplifying way. Thank you.
Okay, so I take over again. So we try to combine how our take on certain topics can be enlarged by combining deservingness and critical diversity studies. And a further point that comes in if we make use of intersectionality, of intersectional analysis, is always to look at power relations. So in which power position is someone and how is privilege combined with power relations, and then do the ethnographic kind of study how deservingness plays into power relations. And then a further point is this invisibility of privilege, these implicit claims of deservingness, and the combination really helps to kind of, if we think of different categories of difference, how they play together in certain contexts. So then we need to choose a concrete figure like the deserving or undeserving migrant, or for example, the social scrounger that our students have designed. So it really helps to reflect upon why privilege might be so invisible with regard to the figure, for example, the students have designed. And finally, there is this congruence and divergence of privilege and deservingness. Sometimes they play ideally together, like in very high managerial positions. Jelena has talked about it, like tax incentives, but sometimes they really diverge. And this would be, again, this figure of the social scrounger our students have designed. It is a figure who seems quite privileged, sitting on a very nice chair, being dressed quite well, and still undeserving because this figure is not kind of engaging in work or is not trying to climb up the hierarchical ladder. So it can all also diverge. So this is really interesting and makes the picture of these two dimensions, deservingness and privilege, more complex, and can analytically sharpen each of our perspectives when we look at certain figures. So This would have been the input by Jelena and me. I have seen there's at least one question already in the chat. This is great. So please add on questions, remarks, anything, also so-called very simple questions. And I just wanted to show you this link to a joint publication. We have already written a working paper on this combination of perspectives on our transdisciplinary dialogue. It came out as in the working paper series from the WU Vienna, so the Wirtschaftsuniversität Wien, and you can find our paper there, and also references to what we've been talking about will be there. And we have also prepared some questions you might think of, and we can discuss. So the one is, which figures best allow for and which figures might complicate a transdisciplinary take on privilege and deservingness. So you can think maybe of figures from your own working environment or from your own experience. How do privilege and deservingness kind of play together? We have talked about the male manager, the IT migrant, the female migrant care worker. Maybe you'll have other figures in mind. And do you have thoughts on comparability of the two dimensions? And finally, this is the topic of this kind of Diversity and Inclusion Week. How can we navigate this complexity, and how can transdisciplinary reflections on deservingness and privilege contribute to inclusive working environments? What should we take into account if we want to really move towards more inclusive working environments? So thank you for the moment. And now we are, I think, the questions will be read out by Prima, or you can also just kind of open your camera and speak to us. But for the questions, I will hand over to Prima.
Cool. So let's see, what questions do we have here? We have little questions for the moment. One is there will be a link to the paper. And the answer is, of course, yes. We always have the presentation afterwards, people. And now a question that we have here, let me see. Okay, here. I wonder how the deservingness is positioned versus a sense of entitlement. Are they objective external versus subjective personal? Are there any studies about this?
Yeah, thanks. Before I try to give an answer, just to add, yeah, so feel free just to put on your screens or cameras so we can have more of a sense of a conversation. But yeah, writing the questions is also fine. So this is a great and interesting topic because because entitlement and deservingness, of course, strongly intersect. I guess for me, entitlement is kind of a bit more related to the issue of rights, and often some kind of more substantial knowledge that goes with that. And with deservingness, we try to analytically capture this more, if you want, moralizing aspect of how people are compared and how their entitlements are claimed. And what we also tried, and this is why we make this differentiation, what we try to do is to use deservingness at the same time as something that we encounter in discourses, in how people moralize inequality, moralize others. So something that's data or something that's empirical, and at the same time an analytical lens. So this would be my answer. And there's, of course, a lot of written about it. Actually, not so much. Before a few years ago, deservingness was used in several papers, but never really conceptualized and theorized. This is why we tried to work this out. So I'm happy to provide any literature. I don't know how, but send links, or if you're interested in, yeah, we can.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome. Hope this is an answer to your question.
Yes, it's very helpful. Thank you.
So feel free, people. As you can see, prefer for this session a more open style of conversation. So if you have any other question, just start speaking.
So we could come back to the figures and think about, if you really reflect about figures, we could try to describe them in more detail.
There is a question, or there is a remark, I think.
As I see one here, I would be very interested in how we as employees, and above all as managers, can draw conclusions from our understanding and acknowledgement of privilege in our daily work and management.
Shall I maybe start, Jelena? Yeah. Okay, so I think one moment which is really important is the invisibility of privilege. And I think to approach the invisibility of privileges, you would need to start a reflection, a self-reflection upon, and this is a really difficult moment. And I also really ask myself quite a lot of times, how can you start to talk about privilege without, in a way, moralizing the fact that you are privileged? Yeah, it is not about kind of starting to feel ashamed about privilege or anything, but still to look at your positionality and start to reflect upon why others might not manage to get there the same way. And this would mean that hierarchies should be, in a way, flattened or softened, or that this self-reflective process might lead to other attitudes and understandings of others. So this process, and I'm very happy also to hear your ideas how this process could be strengthened or just initiated, because I think it's very important. If we think of inclusion, and if we think inclusion means that we listen to the person and to the specificities a person brings along, then we need to start to reflect upon privileges. So this is maybe a little very short, but this is the trajectory I would suggest, how to, in a way, translate these reflections into a working environment.
Maybe just to add a bit on that, if I can. Of course, without denying inequality or inequalities in different ways they play out, I think what also could help in this context of the everyday life of a company is to look at these ambivalences and complexities of privilege, and the fact that people, even though privileged in comparing to others, are also maybe unprivileged in different ways. So it's not, black and white. It's complex and it changes. And to look at this, I think, could be useful. And this is what research tries to kind of zoom in and uncover and see how this actually, what kind of impact this has for the working environment and the everyday work. Oh, we have someone. So this would be a small addition to the question, to the answer, actually.
We have one more here, another one. Was können wir in den Unternehmen besser machen, um dieses Bewusstsein zu fördern? Und falls ihr gleich die nächste Frage, I have to ask in English, right, as well. What can we do in our businesses to make this more increase awareness of this topic? And the next question would be, could you please clarify the relation between deservingness and privilege?
I think
Jelena, you start.
I think the two questions are kind of similar, or do I see this wrongly? The question that we just answered and the one that you just posed in German, in terms of what the impact is of the. Do you agree, Krista? Or?
Yes, I agree. And maybe here we could really turn to critical diversity management, because there are some not very easy, but really there are suggestions how to start to kind of make the working environment more reflective and finally better, so that really connecting, for example, different hierarchical positions in certain projects, so that people start to work together and experience each other and experience different perspectives on the same topic. And this is the flattening of hierarchies, which I mentioned earlier, so that this can really help to also raise the awareness of a privileged position without what you said, Jelena, earlier. This doesn't mean that a high position with a lot of privileges is easy, or that there aren't certain circumstances where this person is not privileged. So that's it's not this either or. It's very complex, but it really helps, I think, also. If critical diversity management wants to add on and kind of lead to inclusion, this means people need to get in contact with each other, listen to each other, try to change perspectives and learn from other perspectives they might not have seen so far. So to overcome also a kind of invisibility of competencies that are hidden in figures that are less privileged than others. So these would be answers where companies really can do something. Then mentoring systems can really help. It's mostly this to be in real direct contact and to work with each other and experience each other. So this would maybe be an add-on to the first question. And for the second, I hand over to you, Jelena.
Thanks. So this one relates a bit more back to what we were trying to do in our paper and how we combine these. Why do we do this? Well, maybe a simple answer is simply that rather than being kind of, how do you say this in English, kind of deckungsgleich or identical, privilege and deservingness, it's interesting to look at when they actually disconnect. So one can be or feel very privileged, but actually feel as, very deserving. And one can be unprivileged and feel or claim or feel as deserving. So and looking at these dynamics, when these different kind of ascriptions and senses meet, and when are they disconnected, and how this changes, it's something where we can learn a lot. So in that sense, privilege and looking at privilege can learn from, zooming in on deservingness and vice versa. And I hope that's why we are trying to do this combined heuristic and learn more about the actual focuses that we are interested in.
Mm-hmm. And maybe one add-on where I see a difference is by that moralization of deservingness is very often a kind of everyday common sense topic. So we all know that, I don't know, let's say this ideal manager deserves privileges, and whereas the privilege as such is very often much more invisible. It is kind of taken more for granted, or as you also said, Jelena, inherited, so that a certain status in society is kind of connected to a kind of natural privilege. And there are quite big differences, I would say.
This ties in perfectly to the next question, which is if there are studies about why privileged people usually usually not aware of their own privilege.
That's really a good question and something to look into through research. Instantly, I can't think of a book or article that I could recommend, but when I think about migration studies, for example, this context that I'm very much familiar with it's usually the contrary, actually, that people who are thinking back on their own migration biography, who end up in privileged or deserving situations, are very aware of, how this came about, and that it was not like this maybe before. So maybe it's this biography or this, social mobility, if you want, an experience of social mobility that more kind of prompts people to be aware of their privilege and inheritance. The other way around, I don't know, but that's just a hypothesis. But I think it's a crucial research question to reconstruct, how this self-understood privilege comes about.
Okay.
Maybe I can
sorry.
add on, that Bourdieu, for example, his concept of habitus, very much built on symbolic meanings that people seem to inherit. So this dimension of not being aware of privilege and not reflecting on it I think the sociologist Bourdieu helps really to understand this idea of entitlement. And another line would be meritocracy, that we are very much trained to believe that people in kind of power positions have worked hard and are therefore they kind of they verdienen, so they should they deserve, exactly. So they are there because they are so extremely skilled. And then studies like Connell show that higher managerial positions do not actually have to be that skilled, but they have to be very self-aware and believe in the power position they are in. And so it does play together, and sometimes, does not play together with the entitlement and deservingness idea. But there, I think, if we really want to move on towards a more inclusive society, we have to start this reflection on privilege together. And
it's interesting because there's very strong psychological aspect to it as well, right? Because regarding the person that has a privilege but doesn't want to know about, let's say, it's not aware. In a way, the moment I admit the privilege, for example, the CEO that you bring about, it's the moment that sort of I admit that a big part of whatever I have achieved, my own self-worth, was due to maybe luck or conditions and not due to myself. And in a way, this is an unconscious self-protection, right? I want to protect my own self-worth. Therefore, I can't even unconsciously admit a part of it was to luck, or for me being in that position that I am on, right? This is the individual part of it. And that ties to the organizational part, which is the next question. We have two very interesting questions that tie together. One is, having whatever hierarchy in a company, will it produce privilege? Like if we have organizational hierarchy, does that per se already produce privilege? And now that's the fun part of the question. Maybe we need these privileges. Maybe there's a positive aspect to having that. Do we need these privileges? Just a second. Last but not least, the last question the very last question that right now ties to this one too, which is asking, and are there studies about business structures or business culture that fall them and that ask for this kind of privilege or not, or build that back, etc.
I can try to start if you want. I'm not an expert on organizational anthropology and looking into companies, but I think the issue of hierarchy is interesting beyond that, of course. I guess hierarchy as such is not per se something bad. I mean, if hierarchy in terms of a division of labor that is based on education, based on experience, based on other things is not based on stigmatization, marginalization based on race, class, gender, and so on, So it's really always the question, what is the hierarchy based on? And what work does it do for example, a company? So if it makes sense and if it's not based on, as I said, stigmatization, it makes sense. So in that sense, privilege can be an aspect of this, if you want, division of labor, which is based on legitimate criteria. But I think that's something that has to be, I guess, continuously reflected upon, for example, in a company, in an organizational setting, since it changes as well. Society changes, companies changes, the inequality regimes in a society change. And this is why it has to be reevaluated continuously.
And maybe I can add on that from a feminist point of view, the take on privilege was really also to talk about unconscious biases that are kind of ingrained into privileges. So that in order to achieve more equality, more kind of equity, also guiding people in a company in a high hierarchical position need to start to reflect upon how the company is built, who is where and why, what kind of inequality regimes are in place and are they fair? So it's also about fair play. And this would be the critical also take on from intersectionality to say where actually, who is in power positions, who defines the criteria for someone, and are the criteria really skills bound, or are they sometimes really built on unconscious biases? And it is in a way also a possibility to start to reflect critically upon how these inequality regimes play out and what could be done to do the whole company to lead it in a more fair way. And I think this question also connects to new work aspects, as we have heard in the very first session where I managed to be, that new work very much builds on the idea of sharing knowledge, of flattening hierarchies. And I think the reflection upon privileges could help. And still, I agree, Jelena, that this doesn't mean that all hierarchies have to be erased. But if they are built, they should be built really on skills and in fair ways, and not, for example, upon the category of gender or the category of migration background or not. It is a tool to reflect upon these categories from a different perspective. And that's why we think it's fruitful to put these two perspectives together.
Thank you very much. We have more questions. Like one question that's maybe very fast to answer is, are there studies about Swissness as one of the factors that brings privilege? Like, because in Swiss companies, it's usual that if you are also Swiss, that helps. And there are studies about that, or maybe in a general sense, if your nationality in a national context, you have an advantage, something like that. This would be one question. And the last question is, would that be a good example of deservingness when a man, sorry for the stereotype, doesn't even think of others starting a career job? I have to read the English here and get what it's meant. But like the other question can maybe be answered about this. Are there studies about nationality being an aspect within companies?
I'm sure there are quite a few. Maybe you can think of some, Krista, as well. But what comes to my mind first is something that I also like to use with my students. It's the study about the bank employees in Zurich by Stefan Leinz and the whole banking culture. And this is a study which is ethnographic, looks at really the everyday life of these bankers in the Bahnhofstrasse. And it's a lot about Swissness. So, but also our colleague Rita Kesslering does some research on Swiss companies in a post-colonial, decolonial context. And there is a number of studies.
Yes,
Okay.
I can maybe add on. Patricia Purchert from the University of Bern has really engaged also in decolonizing Switzerland. So this would also be an interesting aspect. And last but not least, there is one doctoral student in your project, Jelena, who really looks at citizenship, also citizenship. How is it constructed in Switzerland, and who can reach it and who cannot? So, yeah.
Thank you very much. So now our time is closing. I will bring the last. One is the question. The other is a commentary that maybe deserves a commentary about it. Like the question is, would it be an example of deservingness when men in this example here tend to think, oh, I want to be a manager. That's like their career, while women are expected to perform tasks related to organization, operationalization, and which are rarely promotable. This is the question. And the commentary is, be careful of defining the skill as a neutral and legitimate criteria. Interesting work by Nicola Löwe, putting the skill to work. Do not ask what skill is, but what has the power to interpret and define the skill, and the skilled and the non-skilled. So those are the actually two different things, but which are the last questions, sadly, because our time is close.
Yeah, maybe just use a few last minutes. Yeah, I'd completely agree with this kind of reluctance to, use skill as a basis of hierarchy and privilege. I completely agree with you on that. What I just wanted to say is that simply having a company or a world without hierarchies is simply not. It's an ideal. It's not happening. So we have to live with hierarchies, and just to differentiate more or less legitimate ways this should be or could be based on. And of course, if we speak about knowledge and skill as a basis on the hierarchical division of labor, which can also change, we have to zoom into skill, of course, and who decides, who is skilled and when and why, and more skilled than someone else. So absolutely agree on that.
Mm-hmm. And I'm not absolutely sure if I got the first question right you were talking about. So it was about a male manager, and then?
The first one was, let me try to reformulate it. Like, does it count as deservingness in your sense of the concept? When a man usually thinks, like a career job for a man is to be a manager, to be in a leadership position. Is that some kind of deservingness playing a role here?
It is certainly a gendered take on, so that many men, so in our society, this counts as certainly a good way to want to move up the hierarchical ladder. And it is also important to say that if we use these concepts and figures to look at how they are built kind of in societal terms with which categories, this is not per se a critique, but we try to understand how, for example, why is the higher manager mostly still male? Yeah, what happens? Why does he move upwards to this position, and why much less women move up there? And this was the study by Hearn and Niemestieu I cited, that many women are very much marked by this ambivalence. They want to be good mothers and good managers, and this is in a way hindering them to engage kind of only to kind of move upwards this ladder. So these are gendered processes, and it's very flexible and dynamic. As we also try to say, the categories work out differently, and it is just, these are tools to understand better how companies are built, where points like deservingness and privilege are kind of accumulated. And finally, it's the question of this week: how can we make companies and institutions more inclusive? Then this reflection might help to, rebuild certain processes, to look for more equality regimes than inequality regimes.
Thank you very much. Well, that's it for today's session, everybody. Thank you very, very much, Christian and Elena. Awesome topic. I think people were very happy here. And now there comes the question. Now we are talking about a lot of stuff that has to do with us humans and we thinking about this in a very conscious way. And the whole unconscious, automated, partially very questionable stuff with artificial intelligence is coming as our next topic on 5 o'clock today. So don't miss it. And with that said, I wish you all a great afternoon and look forward to seeing you again in 2 hours.
Many thanks.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.